please take a moment to like and subscribe to the show. We ask because today we are looking at a scenario you might not actually believe.
Right, it sounds almost like fiction.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I mean, imagine the federal government knocking on your corporate landlord's door and legally forcing them to sell your rental house back to you, or, another individual buyer within 7 years.
It is a massive shift.
It really is. And that is exactly what is on the table with House Resolution 6644. So this legislation started in the House of Representatives as the Housing for the 21st Century Act, but after reaching the Senate, it was heavily amended.
Heavily amended and completely rebranded.
Yeah, rebranded as the 21st Century ROAD to Housing Act. And our mission today is to break down what analysts consider the most significant federal intervention in the American residential market in decades.
And we are building this analysis directly from the legislative text alongside official Congressional Research Service products and a detailed policy brief.
Right. So looking at those sources, there is a fundamental pivot happening here in federal policy, isn't there?
There is, yeah. Historically, the federal government has treated housing primarily as a social welfare issue.
But just giving out subsidies.
Exactly. Prioritizing demand-side subsidies, essentially giving individuals financial assistance to pay for housing that already exists. But, House Resolution 6644 completely flips that paradigm.
Okay, let's unpack this. We have to start with the core motivation, right?
Yeah.
Which is this massive national housing shortage.
Oh, absolutely. It treats housing as an urgent supply-side infrastructure issue. The focus shifts from just helping people afford rent to physically altering the regulatory landscape so developers can, actually build more units.
Because industry groups, including Up for Growth Action and the National Association of Realtors, estimate the United States is short anywhere from 1.5 million to 3.8 million housing units.
Which is just a staggering number.
It is. If you have tried to buy a home recently, you know exactly what this looks like. A decade of stagnant construction has basically paralyzed the market. First-time buyers are priced out, and renters are forced into these hyper-competitive bidding wars.
The status quo is broken. Everyone acknowledges that.
Right. But looking at the sponsors of this bill, the political alliances are entirely unexpected. You have deregulation-focused Republicans partnering with anti-corporate Democrats. It's like two people steering a ship from opposite sides of the wheel, yet somehow keeping it perfectly straight.
That is a great way to put it. On the House side, the primary sponsor is Representative Jay French-Hill, a Republican from Arkansas's 2nd District. And as a former community banker, he views this through a financial and deregulatory lens.
The whole Make Community Banking Great Again agenda.
Exactly. He championed those provisions. His underlying thesis is that federal bureaucratic friction, specifically drawn-out environmental reviews and layered mortgage compliance, acts as a bottleneck.
It slows everything down.
Right. It adds years to a project timeline and millions of dollars to residential construction costs.
But Representative Hill did not push this through alone. He partnered with the ranking member of the Financial Services Committee, Representative Maxine Waters, a Democrat from California.
Which was crucial for getting the bill moving.
Yeah, her involvement guaranteed that traditional social safety nets were not dismantled. She ensured that programs like the Home Investment Partnerships Program and the CDBG, the Community Development Block Grant System, were preserved and modernized within this new deregulatory framework.
And that same ideological bridging happened over in the Senate. Senator Tim Scott, a Republican from South Carolina and a known fiscal conservative, formed an alliance with Senator Elizabeth Warren,
a Democrat from Massachusetts who focuses heavily on restricting corporate power.
Exactly. They championed the ROAD framework, reforming outdated and archaic designations. Both the populist right and the progressive left identified bureaucratic friction and corporate consolidation as the active enemies of individual homeownership.
So they basically targeted overregulation and corporate land grabbing simultaneously.
They did.
So what does this all mean when we get into the actual mechanics of the bill? Bribing or forcing cities to change their zoning laws only works if developers can afford to build in the first place, right?
Right. And one major target there is NEPA, the National Environmental Policy Act. Under normal circumstances, duplicative federal environmental reviews can pause a project for 12 to 24 months.
And if a developer has a multi-million-dollar loan to buy land, spending 2 years paying interest without laying a single brick, that destroys the project's budget.
Yeah, it completely kills it. So this bill streamlines NEPA requirements specifically for infill projects.
And we should probably define what infill means here for everyone.
Good point. The bill targets developments occurring on previously disturbed land under 5 acres that already utilize existing utilities.
So, not tearing down pristine forests.
Exactly. By allowing the Secretary of Housing and Urban Development and the Secretary of Agriculture to waive certain environmental studies for these specific sites, lawmakers are trying to accelerate urban and suburban revitalization without triggering massive new environmental impacts.
Got it. And legislation also introduces the CDBG Build Now Act, right? Which alters how community development block grants are distributed.
It fundamentally changes it. Historically, these funds are allocated using formulas tied to poverty and blight. House Resolution 6644 introduces a performance-based bonus and penalty structure based on housing growth.
It is essentially the federal government acting like a strict parent. Like the federal government cannot legally force a city to eat its vegetables, meaning they cannot dictate local zoning laws, but they are perfectly allowed to withhold the city's allowance until the plate is clean.
That is exactly how the mechanism works. Municipalities that exceed the median housing growth improvement rate get bonus funding.
But if a jurisdiction falls below that median growth rate, they face a 10% penalty reduction in their annual CDBG allocation. But, doesn't this carrot and stick approach risk punishing cities that are already struggling to grow?
What's fascinating here is precisely how it navigates around constitutional land use authorities. The federal government does not possess the constitutional power to mandate local zoning changes. Those are strictly municipal powers.
Right.
However, by tying federal block grants directly to housing growth metrics, the bill uses financial leverage. A 10% cut to CDBG funding is not just a rounding error for a city. That is money used for crucial infrastructure, like sewer repairs or funding community centers.
So it forces local politicians to choose between protecting restrictive neighborhood zoning or keeping their municipal budgets intact.
Exactly. This competitive environment compels local mayors and city councils to voluntarily dismantle their own restrictive zoning laws to protect their federal funding.
That makes sense. Now, another major mechanical shift deals with manufactured housing. The bill actually repeals the federal requirement that manufactured homes must be constructed with a permanent metal chassis.
Yes, and that is a much bigger deal than it sounds.
Wait, really? So by simply removing the requirement for a permanent chassis, a manufactured home legally transforms from chattel, which is personal property like an RV or a car, into actual real estate once it is affixed to a foundation.
Yes, that is a massive legal loophole closing. It means buyers instantly qualify for standard 30-year fixed mortgages instead of being forced into terrible high-interest personal property loans.
Oh, wow. That is a huge shift.
It is. That technical change directly impacts homeownership accessibility under the $200,000 threshold. The legislation also implements several financial tweaks directed at the banking sector to unlock private capital.
Like raising the public welfare investment cap, right?
Precisely. For nationally chartered banks, it raises the cap from 15% to 20%. Banks are legally limited in how much capital they can expose to certain public welfare investments.
So raising that cap by 5% allows banks to deploy significantly more capital into projects utilizing the low-income housing tax credit.
Exactly, which is the primary engine for affordable rental housing production in the United States.
Okay, and think about if you have ever tried to buy a starter home or a fixer-upper in a low-cost area, you have probably realized that banks do not want to give you a $70,000 mortgage.
They really don't.
The bill addresses exactly this by pushing to revitalize small-dollar mortgages loans with an original principal balance under $100,000.
Because the bank pays the same flat fees for underwriting, appraisals, and compliance, whether the loan is for $70,000 or $700,000,
Well,
the profit margin on a small loan is completely wiped out by those fixed costs.
right. So House Resolution 6644 directs federal banking regulators to modify appraisal and compliance rules to make these small-dollar loans viable again.
The intention across all these provisions is very clear. Increase the physical supply of housing by cutting red tape, and simultaneously open up the financial pathways necessary for individuals to purchase that new supply.
But increasing the housing supply and making mortgages more accessible does not solve the affordability crisis if regular families are constantly outbid by massive corporations paying entirely in cash.
No, it doesn't.
And that reality brings us directly to the most hotly debated section of the Senate Amendment Title IX.
Title IX focuses entirely on the rise of large institutional investors, or LIIs, in the single-family rental market.
This trend really accelerated heavily after the 2008 financial crisis, didn't it? When corporations bought up foreclosed homes in bulk.
It did, and the legislation imposes a strict limit on that now. Any entity that owns 350 or more single-family homes is explicitly prohibited from purchasing additional properties.
It is a hard cap on corporate landlords. But there are exceptions. These investors can still make accepted purchases, which include newly constructed homes or properties intended for senior communities.
But here is the catch. Those exceptions come with a rigid 7-year disposal mandate.
Meaning they have to sell them.
Yes, the investors must sell those accepted properties to individual home buyers within 7 years of the purchase date. And the disposal mandate comes with strict operational rules during that 7-year window.
Like, these massive investors cannot just quietly sell the portfolio to another corporation.
No, they cannot. They must publicly advertise the property. They must offer the current renter the first option to purchase the home.
That is a big deal for renters.
It is. And crucially, they must allow current renters to renew active leases for up to 36 consecutive months prior to any sale, providing stability to the tenant while the property transitions back to the individual market.
The goal is clearly to force housing stock back onto Main Street, but this has triggered massive industry pushback. I mean, the National Association of Home Builders, the NAHB, actually withdrew their support for the entire bill because of Title IX.
They did. They argue this ban will decimate the build-to-rent sector,
which currently makes up anywhere from 3% to 10% of new single-family housing starts. And honestly, their concern makes mechanical sense. If developers lose the forward funding commitments from these massive institutional buyers, won't they just stop building those homes entirely?
That is exactly the fear. A developer goes to a bank for a $50 million loan to build a neighborhood. The bank wants guarantees.
Right.
If an institutional investor pre-buys 100 homes, the bank approves the loan. If you ban the investor, the bank says no, and 0 homes get built. That is the core tension of Title IX. The legislation aggressively tries to protect Main Street buyers from being outbid by Wall Street, but in doing so, it risks freezing the professional construction capital that is necessary to actually build the new housing supply.
It's a huge trade-off. And economists from the Brookings Institute and the Cato Institute are warning about severe capital flight.
They are. Large investors provide a stable source of capital that can withstand market downturns better than individual buyers. If you force these investors to sell their properties on a rigid 7-year timeline, it could trigger periodic fire sales that artificially depress neighborhood property values.
Not to mention there is also a major risk regarding rent inflation. Banning investors from purchasing existing homes could severely restrict the overall supply of single-family rentals.
Which hurts the families who rely on them.
Exactly. For families who rely on renting a house, perhaps they need the space for children but do not have a down payment. This reduced rental inventory means heightened competition. That inevitably drives up their monthly rent prices.
And beyond the economic impacts, there are immediate constitutional challenges looming. The 7-year forced sale mandate will almost certainly face lawsuits under the Fifth Amendment's takings clause.
So wait, how does that work legally?
Well, the legal argument there is substantial. The government has the power of eminent domain. They can seize your property for public use if they compensate you.
Right.
But requiring a private entity to divest a privately held asset to another private citizen within a specific time frame without a clear public health or safety emergency is highly unusual. Legal scholars expect this to be challenged as an illegal regulatory taking.
And if this gets tied up in years of litigation, that institutional capital simply sits on the sidelines, right? Which just worsens the supply crunch.
Exactly.
Okay, well, here's where it gets really interesting. While the housing market implications are vast, the legislative negotiations introduced an element completely outside of real estate. Section 1001 of the bill introduces a temporary prohibition on the Federal Reserve issuing a retail central bank digital currency, or CBDC.
It really is quite the pivot.
Yeah. I mean, how does digital currency end up in a housing bill?
It emerged as a critical bargaining chip during the Senate negotiations. Conservative members demanded this provision, citing serious privacy and surveillance concerns.
Okay.
They argued that a retail digital currency could lead to a social credit system where the federal government has the power to track and potentially restrict the private spending of individual citizens. The inclusion of this ban until December 31st, 2030, was essential to secure the support of the libertarian-leaning wing of the Republican Party.
But the fact that the ban is only temporary has sparked an intense legal debate over negative inference. Senator Ted Cruz submitted an amendment, Senate Amendment 4344, focused entirely on this issue.
Yes, the negative inference argument is fascinating.
To break down the legal logic simply, if Congress passes a law saying the Federal Reserve cannot issue a CBDC until 2030, a judge in 2031 is going to look at that statute and assume Congress wouldn't have put an expiration date on the ban if they didn't think the Federal Reserve was legally allowed to do it afterward.
Exactly.
By temporarily banning it, they're legally implying the underlying authority exists.
This raises an important question regarding statutory interpretation. The legislation attempts to restrict the Federal Reserve's power in the short term, but critics argue it inadvertently expands that power in the long term by acknowledging it exists post-2030.
So nobody is happy.
Right. This debate ensures that neither the privacy advocates nor the legal scholars demanding a permanent prohibition are fully satisfied, creating a major point of friction as the bill moves forward.
Well, we have covered the macroeconomic strokes and the high-level political maneuvering, but who are the specific individuals whose lives change tomorrow if this passes?
That is the most important part to look at. Title VI of the Act provides very targeted interventions. For example, it alters the VASH program, the Veterans Affairs Supportive Housing Program.
Because under previous rules, severely injured veterans were actually deemed too wealthy to qualify for housing assistance simply because their disability benefits were counted as income.
Which is just a tragic oversight in the system.
It is. Wait, so a veteran loses a limb, gets a higher disability check to compensate for that life-altering injury, and the government turns around and says, sorry, you make too much money for housing assistance now. That is a completely absurd structural flaw.
It was a perverse incentive loop that actively penalized veterans for their service-connected injuries. House Resolution 6644 fixes this by explicitly excluding disability benefits from being counted as income for the VASH program.
That makes total sense. It ensures the most severely injured veterans can access the supportive housing they require.
It also addresses an unseen crisis among seniors in federally assisted housing by establishing a pilot program for temperature sensors.
Temperature sensors.
Yes, these sensors will continuously monitor compliance with federal heating and cooling requirements, allowing the Department of Housing and Urban Development to intervene before extreme weather events lead to heat stroke or hypothermia among elderly residents.
Okay, so it is a vital, proactive safety measure. But, all of these targeted impacts and new grants must be viewed against the broader financial reality.
The math always comes back into play.
Always. The United States currently has a $1.9 trillion deficit. While the original House version of the bill was projected to be largely deficit neutral due to its focus on deregulation, the addition of these new grant programs and pilot initiatives in the Senate has altered the math.
Significantly.
Yeah, and members of the House Freedom Caucus are demanding that the bill be funded through reconciliation. They want to offset the costs of these new housing grants by aggressively cutting waste elsewhere in social service programs. So, with all that, what is the actual probability that this legislation makes it into law?
Well, if we connect this to the bigger picture, the probability of passage hinges entirely on resolving the amendments introduced by the Senate.
Because the House and Senate passed different versions.
Exactly. The timeline is as follows. The bill originally passed the House of Representatives with a massive bipartisan majority, 390 to 9, on February 9, 2026.
Almost unanimous.
Right. It then moved to the Senate, where it passed 8-9 to 1-0 on March 12, 2026. However, the Senate passed it with the Scott Warren Compromise Amendment, which integrated the Title IX corporate ban and the temporary CBDC ban.
And because the text was changed, it must return to the House for final reconciliation.
Yes. The probability of this becoming law rests entirely on whether the House will accept the Title IX ban on corporate landlords, which has caused major industry groups to pull their support, and whether they can accept the temporary nature of the CBDC ban despite the demands for a permanent prohibition.
It really shows you this is not just abstract policy happening in a vacuum. If passed, House Resolution 66644 will actively dictate who is allowed to buy the house next door to you.
It absolutely will.
It will determine what interest rates your local community bank can offer you for a starter home. It will influence how your local city council manages its zoning laws to avoid losing federal grant money.
It forces a national reevaluation of what purpose housing serves. Is it an investment vehicle for large-scale capital accumulation, Or is it a fundamental resource for individual stability that requires protection from corporate consolidation?
And the legislation attempts to balance market-based supply incentives with aggressive anti-corporate regulation. But I want to leave you with a new angle to ponder based on everything we have discussed today.
Oh, what is that?
Well, if Title IX successfully forces multi-billion-dollar corporations out of the single-family housing market, what will fill that massive capital vacuum? Could we see the rise of neighborhood-level decentralized real estate trusts, where regular citizens pool their money to crowdfund local developments and replace the massive corporate buyers? It is definitely something to think about. Thank you for joining us for this analysis of House Resolution 6644.